My lightning talk is called Questions, and I liked Jeff's last week, so I figured I'd do another kind of non-technical sort of domain talk. So there's an Old English proverb that says, "He that nothing questions, nothing learns." And I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of questions that there are and kind of how to use them to basically get the information you want or lead people down the path that you'd like them to go down. Some of the things that I think I'm about to say may seem almost mind-numbingly obvious, but they will be a little bit different contextualized in the form of the kind of question taxonomy. So again, as a teaching tool, you can use them for diagnosing, understanding, explaining something, to emphasize something. So if you question something that you're talking about, that tends to emphasize that point. And then just to help a pair you're working with maybe retain knowledge. If you think that someone you're working with is struggling, there are plenty of good ways to ask them questions in a way that will help emphasize and help them retain that knowledge. So, and then to just kind of like motivate, when you can ask somebody questions in a way that builds their confidence. So like asking somebody's opinion, people will tend to feel more confident if you're working with someone who's a little bit tentative. Asking their opinion, asking them questions as you're doing something definitely helps that person to learn more. And then from like a social perspective, you foster conversations when you ask questions, when you show that you're willing to learn about something. You learn the way somebody thinks by asking how or why they're doing something. And then to encourage just a particular course of action, there are certain types of questions that you can use for that. So as with any sort of conceptual taxonomy, there are kind of blurred edges between the different cases, and the things that are considered good are not always good, and the things that are considered bad are also not always bad. So here are the types of questions that generally people kind of refer to in teaching blogs and education as good questions. So closed questions are questions that only allow for a short, usually one-word answer. Something like, did you write a test for that? Only allows somebody to answer yes or no. This question gets you like knowledge very fast, but doesn't really allow for the person to expound on what they have to say. Now, open question is more open-ended than a closed question. Something like, why do you think we don't write a test here? So that asks the opinion of somebody. That lets them kind of explain their complete reasoning behind taking a course of action. Recall questions are questions that just ask somebody to recall somebody. Did we write a test last time we wrote code like this? Did we do this last time? And then from like a social level, oh yeah, can you tell me where this office is? Something like that is generally considered a recall question. Process questions are questions that ask somebody to describe a schema. So how do we do something? How do you usually test this sort of thing? How do you usually write a code like this? And divergent questions is a question with no specific answer, but lets the answerer kind of describe their opinion on something. So again, there's a lot of bleed over between these questions, but a divergent question would be, well, what do you think is the best way to test this type of server-side API call? What do you think is the best way to do this thing? And that lets them, there's no specific yes or no answer, but it lets the person who you're talking to express their opinion in that particular way. And like, a divergent question is usually an open question, and there's a lot of bleed between all of these things. And then factual questions. Great. So, have you been organizing your spec files in any particular way? What specific thing have you done? That's a fact. Like the way something has been done. Often, they're called a historical question, but basically it's just you're asking for facts. Does anybody have any questions on that aspect of the breakdown?
We're fine here.
Cool. All right. So now the sometimes bad, or the questions that don't generally help you get too far, with somebody, or the questions that people might consider not so good. Now, again, some of these may seem like the exact same questions that are before in the good ones, or they may have uses for you as you're working with somebody. So leading or loaded questions are, if you've seen any courtroom drama and someone says objection leading the witness, these are questions that lead someone down a specific path, so they think, they might feel like their answer is not correct when they're answering it. So like, oh man, what went wrong with this controller, leads somebody to think that there is something wrong with this controller, rather than like, something that nobody exactly knows what happens, or how do you think we can refactor this implies that something needs to be refactored. So generally these are not great when you're teaching, but they're good to express your opinion to somebody when you're asking a question. So like, how late do you think we'll be working on this? Implies that you think that we'll be late when we're working on that thing. Rhetorical questions. I think everybody knows what these are. These are questions that you don't really expect an answer for. You don't really ask a rhetorical question so much as you say a rhetorical question. Generally, they're not great because there's no real option for somebody to answer them or express their opinion, but they're great if you just want to get somebody thinking about something without starting a conversation at the time. And then dichotomous questions. So those are questions that that get answered as bools. True/false questions, yes/no questions, questions that only have one or two answers. Now I'm going to talk about a little kind of more of a technique than an individual question called funneling. So funneling questions are a series of questions that you ask in order to bring somebody to a specific point. So in order to get somebody to either think about things as they're going on and learn something on their own, or in order to kind of drive somebody to a particular course of action. So these, when you're using funneling questions, you might want to start closed and get more open, despite what you may think of a funnel doing. Starting closed doesn't really let somebody, just get to the answer right away, but you can start to lead them down to the path, to the point that you're doing. So starting with a yes/no question. So, what are we doing here is pretty closed. It's just, we're doing X, Y, or Z. Is this like something we were working on the other day? There's a little bit more thinking. You get to, even though the answer is yes or no, but you get to kind of think about the past and kind of recall exactly what you were working on. And then, do you think that applies? That applies here too, right? If you were working with somebody, saying what are we doing here is not going to get that person to maybe think of the correct pattern, but starting in by flowing from these closed to open questions might drive someone to that route. Cool. So here are just some of my thoughts. When you're using questions to either drive to a particular point, it's really important to know where you want to go to when you start. So if you're using funneling, just starting at the top, you want to have an idea where you want to lead somebody to, where you want to go. When you're, and some of the more closed questions this doesn't really apply to. Obviously, you need to know what information you want in order to ask the question, but using a chain is a little bit different. The usefulness of any of these types of questions is always contextual, so you need to know exactly what context you're in order to ask a question. So if you want to use a loaded question in order to bring somebody to a specific point, that's great. But if you want to know really what that person thinks about a particular course of action without leading them in any particular way. You would want to phrase your question so it's not loaded, so there's no opinion expressed in that question. And then probably the most important thing about questioning is giving people time to answer. You have to get comfortable with silence when you're asking a question that you want people to answer. Sitting there letting people think, it takes time for people to think of a great response or the response that they want to give. And it may be awkward for you if you want an answer right away, or you want to move on to the next thing right away. But giving people time to answer is really important if you want good answers to your questions.
All right, today I am going to talk to you all about flow cytometry. What is flow cytometry, you might ask? Well, it is a machine that I helped build and work on for about 8 years or so at my old job, and one that I'm a little intimately familiar with at this point. But also, more than that, what flow cytometry really is fancy counting, in particular for biological purposes or applications. In the past, this really was a problem that a particular lab or researcher would throw at grad students and interns to deal with by putting a slide on a sample, or putting a grid on a sample, essentially, and telling them to find how many white blood cells were in quadrant 1 and then quadrant 2, and extrapolating from that the composition of the entire sample. Nowadays, we have managed to automate this. These were all pictures of the Accuray C6, which is the machine I helped work on back in the day. What you're looking at here is a picture of the SIP, which is a thin tube up which you are able to draw sample into the machine. The samples could be blood, it could be blended mouse spleens, it could be algae-infested water, what have you. This SIP uses a process called microfluidics and a certain degree of science magic to create a sheath of water with a hollow core within that sheath to be able to draw a single cell up the tube at a time. That is sent through the fluidics to the sensor array, at which point you will shine a laser at the cell. I believe over here are the forward and side scatter sensors. Those are determined to detect how much light is scattered off the cell when it hits the laser, basically giving you, with larger cells, more forward and side scatter when you hit it, giving you the size of the cells. And then around the sides are the fluorescent detectors. You can see FL1, FL2, FL3, and this one would be FL4. Those are built to detect certain dyes that are created by these scientists. They use the bioluminescence that is provided by the genetic code of certain undersea creatures, such as this crazy jellyfish here. And what they do is using further science magic, they create these dyes so that they only adhere to specific protein chains, i.e. Cancerous cells or dead white blood cells, if it's like an HIV test or what have you. In that way, depending on what dyes have adhered themselves to however many cells in your sample, your fluorescent channels will pick up on different expressions of light in order to get even more of a categorization and count of what you have in that particular sample. And you can see this is the output of what you would get from a particular sample. I believe, if I had to make a guess, this set of plots is actually just calibration beads, which is something that the scientists use to test out that their lasers are detecting the right thing. The peaks are pretty uniform and well spread out to say, okay, you have, this is just a vial of liquid with a certain amount of red beads in it that will fluoresce red when agitated by a laser to calibrate your system. And this one, on the other hand, is a more realistic looking example. In fact, you see that they have taken this slide and labeled their quadrants for the particular types of cells that they're looking for. And it's once again through further science magic that scientists are able to actually use these these graphs and produce usable results for their experiments. And that, for the most part, is the entirety of what flow cytometry entails. There is more mathemagician things that I could get into, such as virtual gain or color compensation, that are ways of tweaking the existing data that comes off the sensors in order to better illustrate a particular sample. Color compensation is the adjustment of one fluorescent channel by a percentage of another fluorescent channel in order to compensate, quote unquote, for the fact that the spectrum is such that there will be bleed over from the red-blue channel and the green channels when you are detecting. Virtual gain is actually something I believe my company made up, which was at one point the way to adjust certain peaks and valleys to be more or less prominent in the sample collection was to actually adjust the voltage of the machine as it was collecting. But since ours was focused on simplicity of use, virtual gain allowed you to simulate that voltage change after the fact. So this is, after all, a lightning talk for a computer science company or a software development company. So you might wonder, why did I just give you a whole talk about flow cytometry? Well, that is the basic level that I like to strive for when given a new problem or domain. You'll notice that I don't have all the answers about how flow cytometry works. Things like microfluidics and the adherence of bioluminescent dyes are still basically science and engineering magic to me. But from end to end, I can have, and actually this has been tested in random bar conversations recently, a coherent and reasonable conversation with an actual microbiologist that uses a flow cytometer. There's even more, I'm sure, because of the amount of time rattling around my brain that I've worked on that one than just the basics of it. I could go into actual brands and types of flow cytometers and the pros and cons of them, but that's neither here nor there. That the basic concept and driving force behind this is called domain-driven design and development. And that is to make your code, through the magic of object-oriented design and programming, reflect the object model of the real world as much as possible. And this is something that I've used throughout my career. on such diverse topic as flow cytometry, diagnosis of large vehicle transmissions. This is, I believe, a rig where you put a transmission between two electric motors, you hook up a variety of sensors to it, and you basically run that, you automate that transmission through various up and down shifts until it essentially explodes. If you look in the background here, you can see pretty heavily reinforced bulletproof glass there. And what they do is the sensors will show, okay, in the downshifts, here are the parts where we're generating an excessive amount of heat or noise or excessive force and torque on these components. And it was helped to automate and test out mechanical shifting mechanisms and algorithms that drove a manual transmission. Have used this for home flood insurance, talking about the various components that guide the rate that you will get from your insurance company, such as your flood zone or your first floor above ground levels elevation, or where the flood waters are average in that particular flood zone. These are all terms that are not defined by us, the software developers, but are specific to the domain. And lastly, probably most fun, we got to use it for dog agility and the distribution of plaques and certificates to particular dogs and their owners for the legs that they had run in a dog agility competition. Faultless legs, I believe. So yeah, the whole reason behind this, and I'm recording this after the fact so there will be no real questions, is to make the transition of knowledge between technical and non-technical at all levels of your project as smooth as possible. The Accurace flow cytometer project is a special case. I was on it for 7.5 to 8 years, and as many as 80 different developers probably touched it at some point or other. I would wager by this point, I think all of those developers would be able to give some version of this talk. It may have more detail, it might have less detail, but they would probably use a lot of the same words and have a lot of the same gaps, to be fair. And this was just, well, there's a lot of ways to accomplish this. First off, this slide says questions, but one of the most important things to remember is never be afraid to look stupid in front of their domain experts. It actually is really helpful most of the time for most clients, because a willingness to ask the stupid question to a domain expert tends to engender a response, a genuine response. If you want to genuinely learn something, really, most domain experts seem to appreciate that. The other is, I think one of the most fun ways that we dealt with this is to teach it yourself. This presentation didn't take me a whole lot of time to put together, but I've internalized it through a long time. It's been years since I've worked on it, but I could probably put it together again if I deleted all these slides within a good half hour to an hour. But one of the ways that happened is because at my old job, we were constantly hiring new developers for various projects, and usually when that happened, one of the assignments would go to the second newest developer and have them teach the entire domain to the newest developer. It would be wrong a lot of the times, but it definitely helped expose the questions that needed more exposing, and also helped firm up the places that you did understand. And lastly, the biggest thing I think to get out of this particular thing is make sure your code uses the same words that you use in a conversation with a non-technical person. In this one, it's dogs, legs, runs, and oh shoot, certificates, I believe, is the highest award. And this one, it's flood zone. It's base flood elevation. It's first floor above ground and things like that. And here it's sensors and waveforms, and time is usually the big ones in this. And that you've heard many examples of fluorescence, channels, sample, all throughout this. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.